So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the subjects in the chapter from Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Oreskes. The long title of the book is Merchants of Doubt: How a Handful of Scientists Obscured the Truth on Issues from Tobacco Smoke to Global Warming. And of course, our chapter is Chapter 1, Doubt is Our Product, from the book, and it's about the tobacco industry and its relationship to scientists and to universities and research. I think the title of the book, Merchants of Doubt, really gives away the function that Oreskes and the co-author Conway see in the scientific community when it served the interests of the tobacco industry or any other industry. They, in her view, manufacture doubt. It's not that they can completely obliterate the findings of science that contradict their point of view, but much like in a court of law where the lawyers have to prove a reasonable doubt, scientists in their capacity as testifiers in court cases and just generally as producers of information can manufacture enough doubt to deflect people from certain conclusions that would not benefit the industries that they serve. So this chapter is about the tobacco industry's relationship with science, particularly what I would call scientific friends and scientific enemies. One of the more powerful aspects of the chapter is that Oreskes spends time on who the scientists were who were involved in helping the tobacco industry, and they were scientists with great credentials and a lot of prestige who had worked for very well-known and respectable universities and agencies. So Frederick Seitz is one of those scientists, and just to give an example of his pedigree, on page 10, she says, Seitz was one of America's most distinguished scientists, a wunderkind, who had helped build the atomic bomb. Seitz had spent his career at the highest levels of American science, a science advisor to NATO in the 1950s, president of the National Academy of Sciences in the 1960s, president of the Rockefeller University, America's leading biomedical research institution in the 1970s. In 1979, Seitz had just retired, and he was there to talk about one last job, a new program which he would run on behalf of R.J. Reynolds, which is a tobacco company, to fund biomedical research at major universities, hospitals, and research institutes across the country. Another one that she chronicles in this chapter is James A. Shannon. And she says Shannon was a physician who pioneered the use of the anti-malaria drug Atabrine during World War II. Later, as director of the National Institutes of Health from 1955 to 1968, he transformed the NIH by convincing Congress to allow them to offer grants to university and hospital researchers. Eventually, she says, it produced the gargantuan granting system that is the core of the NIH today, propelling the United States to leadership in biomedical research. She also mentions Macklin McCarty. She says, similarly, he had a fabulously successful career without being fabulously recognized. Many people have heard of James Watson and Francis Crick, who won the Nobel Prize for deciphering the double helix structure of DNA, but Watson and Crick did not prove that DNA carried the genetic information in the cells. That crucial first step had been done a decade earlier in 1944 by three bacteriologists from Rockefeller University, Oswald Avery, Macklin McCarty, and Colin MacLeod. So this person, too, did amazing things and was a well-established scientist. The Rockefeller University is not the only university mentioned. In fact, the authors say that around 100 different universities received research grants from the tobacco industry over time. And also other prestigious outfits are mentioned, such as the Sloan Kettering Institute, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the National Cancer Institute, and the Office of the U.S. Surgeon General. So there's no need to belabor the examples, which you can and should read in this chapter. So I want to kind of dwell more on the questions that it raises and the general themes that come up in this chapter having to do with the authority and credibility of science. What we find in here is a story of scientists who, as Chris Hedges argues in The Death of the Liberal Class, more or less, in the view of Oreskes, and I'm sure Hedges would agree, more or less sold out for the sake of money, power, prestige, and things like that, instead of staying true to the objectivity that they would state is so important in the scientific endeavor. Remember that we've kind of developed the notion through Hedges that Americans have this love-hate relationship with science. Scientists say, or experts say, has become a claim to authority in the country, and I think that people who aren't scientists still would say that they respect science a great deal, but they don't when the science that's put forward disagrees with something that they deeply feel is right. Then they tend to discount the science. And I think what Hedges argues is that this is easier because there are so many cases of science actually being skewed and biased due to the intervention or the intervening variable of corporate money in the scientific process. So I think I mentioned last time the rather obvious case of a company such as Monsanto, which is deep into the thickets of academia in colleges of ag, in sponsoring lots and lots of research. So we have examples in this chapter of prestigious, very accepted scientists working directly for the tobacco industry in such entities as the Tobacco Industry Committee for Public Information and the Tobacco Industry Research Committee. We have literally hundreds of examples of scientists and departments of, I'm sure, biology, various agricultural departments, horticultural departments, etc., taking major grants to fund research. The grants given by the tobacco industry to fund research that either intentionally or unintentionally obscured tobacco's responsibility for causing cancer, and numerous scientists publishing peer-reviewed journal articles whose research was paid for and supported by the tobacco industry. This is very much the type of behavior that Chris Hedges describes in The Death of the Liberal Class as a sort of selling out. And part of it comes from a bifurcation of responsibility. I mentioned last time the fact-value distinction. It's possible for scientists to see their work in very, very narrow, concrete terms and to think of it as always positive if something is being found out by their investigations. What use is put of that to that later on is really not seen as their concern. And so it's possible for scientists involved in these enterprises to convince themselves that they are doing basic research and that basic research is morally neutral, and to avoid personally any responsibility for the use of the research later on. And I think that is, I think in Hedges' view, a sort of mental maneuver that is used to avoid responsibility, but at the same time, somebody like Hedges, and I think Oreskes too, thinks that scientists if they do the mental maneuver, it isn't to the extent that they don't know that they're also benefiting from the large amounts of money that's put into said research. In other words, they make the connection and don't make the connection, and this is part of the human condition. This is the way that people get through their day, you might say, while knowingly engaging in activities that are not completely good, while still wanting to think of themselves as good. All of this moral speculation is something that scientists oftentimes say that they don't need to engage in. That is not a part of their responsibility. But we have these authors that basically are insisting that it is their responsibility. Now, where it really gets sticky is when scientists were paid to give testimony in judicial proceedings supporting the tobacco industry. There it is difficult to imagine how the person could not see themselves as basically being in the employ of a particular industry. But I suppose they might have thought that they were there to give testimony about their scientific findings, and that the judicial process would work as it would on its own, weighing their information in the balance against other information. Also, we have examples of scientists giving interviews to journalists in support of the idea that it was impossible to prove whether anyone in particular, any one person, got cancer due to tobacco, to smoking, as opposed to other factors. And we have the case of Seitz, who's prominently featured in this chapter as getting caught up in party politics. In that case, we have a scientist who is, one would have to think, more loyal to his political ideology than to science, and therefore, at least Oreskes seems to be arguing, what became so biased in favor of the political agenda that he was incapable of thinking objectively about his own science, or more generally the scientific findings having to do with smoking. So, in other words, I think that these authors, Hedges and Oreskes, are arguing that scientists are human beings like everybody else, and meaning that they are very likely to be biased in the direction of where they see their benefit coming from, especially if that is tied to their very livelihood and success and status in life, and that they are not as objective as they would like to believe, and that the public knows this, so that science is not on its own enough. These authors kind of come from this whole issue the same way that Jacques Ellul does when he's dealing with technique. Ellul would insist that people first have to have a notion of right and wrong. They have to have a moral code, and that moral code, whatever that is, has to be based upon facts, such as, what actually promotes people's health and well-being. That it's not just a subjective and politically charged thing, but the moral code should be about objectivity, what causes health, what causes peace amongst people, etc. And Ellul would say that you have to have that code in mind before you then know how to deal with technique, what to do with various technologies and procedures, how to employ them, what not to do. In other words, he would argue, and I think these authors are all in agreement, that that the moral perspective has to govern science rather than science going off on its own without a direction. That what you find when science says it's going off on its own without a direction, it's actually being led by who and what does the choosing, and that has to do with money. And basically, they argue people need to face it, including scientists. But ultimately, at the end of this chapter, I just want to point out that Oreskes actually somewhat falls victim to the same views about science that are part of the problem. And there seems to be a little bit of contradiction here. On page 32, she asks the question of whether, say, pro-tobacco and anti-tobacco scientists deserve equal time. And she says the simple answer is no. And it's her reason why no that's interesting here. She says, while the idea of equal time for opposing opinions makes sense in a two-party political system, it does not work for science because science is not about opinion. It is about evidence. It is about claims that can be and have been tested through scientific research, experiments, experience, and observation, research that is then subject to critical review by a jury of scientific peers. Claims that have not gone through that process or have gone through it and failed are not scientific and do not deserve equal time in a scientific debate. But I dare say that many of the articles and pieces of science that were used to defend the tobacco industry's position about smoking over the years were peer-reviewed publications in scientific journals. And at any rate, she repeats the story that science is not about opinion, but that is a story of sorts. It's a story that scientists often tell us. But the reason why it may be a story is that it doesn't get to the heart of the problem that Oreskes has actually described, which is that something outside of the objective fact-finding process is involved in choosing what to investigate in the first place. And that's where opinion always comes in, about what's important to look at, what questions are important to ask. And so once those choices are made, even if the resulting research is very objective, there is still a bias involved in the scientific decision about what questions to ask. Early on in the chapter, she says, the focus of the new program that CITES was going to head up for the tobacco industry was degenerative diseases, cancer, heart disease, emphysema, diabetes, the leading causes of death in the United States, and the project was huge. $45 million would be spent over the next 6 years. The money would fund research at Harvard, the universities of Connecticut, California, Colorado, Pennsylvania, and Washington, the Sloan Kettering Institute, and not surprisingly, the Rockefeller University. A typical grant was $500,000 per year for 6 years, a very large amount of money for scientific research in those days. The program would support 26 different research programs, plus 6 young investigators on RJR research scholarships in the areas of chronic degenerative disease, basic immunology, the effects of lifestyle modes on disease. But as she points out, even though these were all legitimate subject matter for scientific research, and many of these things like lifestyle modes played a part in the development of cancer in some people, they were chosen because they deflected attention from another question, which is how much smoking has to do with causing cancer. The scientists involved, though, I'm sure told themselves the story of how scientific research is always objective because it always deals with facts, because they indeed did deal with facts when they did their investigations, and I have no doubt published many of their factual findings in peer-reviewed scientific journals. I think that Oreskes' statement about science near the end of the chapter just goes to show how deeply ingrained is our faith in science. And yet the fact that she's written the book, and also that Chris Hedges wrote his book, basically states that we do have this love-hate relationship with science, or this simultaneous faith and disbelief. And we hold both of those positions at the same time, and it makes it more difficult for us as a society to think about questions such as Hedges raised in his piece on global warming. Echoing Hedges' concern about journalists, Oreskes talks about how journalists would listen to the information put out by the scientific supporters of the tobacco industry, and it would cast just enough doubt upon other scientific findings, and this would lead the journalists, in the name of fair and balanced reporting or equal time, to cast doubt upon notions that smoking causes cancer. And to drive home Hedges' point by using a point from Oreskes' chapter, we have the example of Edward R. Murrow, who is described by Conservapedia as a left-wing American journalist and television figure. He was very prominent with his series of radio news broadcasts during World War II, and he was highly respected in the 1950s. So, speaking of the balance that was being aimed at by journalists, she says, balance was interpreted, it seems, as giving equal weight to both sides rather than giving accurate weight to both sides. Even the great Edward R. Murrow fell victim to these tactics. In 1956, Hill and Knowlton reported on a conference held with Murrow, his staff, and their producers, Fred Friendly. Producer. Hill and Knowlton, just to remind you, was the PR firm that was employed by the tobacco industry to come up with a scientific backing against the cancer connection. So this is Hill and Knowlton's reporting back to the tobacco people on a conference held with the journalist Edward R. Murrow and his staff and the producer Fred Friendly. They said, the Murrow staff emphasized the intention to present a coldly objective program with every effort made to tell the story as it stands today, with special effort towards a balanced perspective and concrete steps to show that the facts still are not established and must be sought by scientific means, such as the research activities the Tobacco Industry Research Committee will support. And then Oreskes says, balance, cold objectivity, these were Murrow's trademarks, along with his dangling cigarette, and the tobacco industry exploited them both. Murrow's later death from lung cancer was both tragic and ironic, for during World War II, Murrow had been an articulate opponent of meretricious balance in reporting. As David Halberstam has put it, Murrow was not ashamed to take the side of democracy and felt no need to try to get the Nazi perspective or consider how isolationists felt. There was no need to balance Hitler against Churchill. Yet Murrow fell prey to the tobacco industry's insistence that their self-interested views should be balanced against independent science. Perhaps, being a smoker, he was reluctant to admit that his daily habit was deadly, and reassured to hear that the allegations were unproven. And that brings up another theme in this chapter, and that is that when one is doing something like smoking cigarettes, even if one is a journalist or a scientist, both with an ideal of objectivity, one is loath to admit that one is doing something irrational and self-destructive, and so the other information that supports one's own point of view tends to be respected more than it otherwise would be. This is all to say that it's harder for human beings to be objective than they think, and that we repeatedly get caught up in these highly ideologically and emotionally charged battles where we fling around the ideas of scientific objectivity and fair and balanced journalistic integrity and so on and so forth. And the American public, being lay people, most of them neither engaged in science nor in journalism, can still pick up on the lack of certainty and maybe the lack of integrity at certain levels of this process from these entities, journalism and science, and rather sadly but reasonably conclude that they can't really believe what they say. It's a huge problem for our society, this extreme skepticism and doubt, to where people cannot believe what's presented as scientific fact and deeply doubt the integrity of the journalists who have the task of conveying facts about our political system and about our economy and about our environment. And I think these authors help us to understand that we cannot hold harmless or completely innocent the people involved, the journalists and the scientists and the professors and educators and researchers who at one and the same time hold a highly respected and prestigious place in society, and at the same time are treated with an incredible amount of doubt and cynicism. This is a fundamental problem for a democracy because without trust in our sources of information, citizens are on their own and have to go with their gut. And one might argue that the political turmoil that we're now dealing with has something to do with the level of doubt and insecurity about the process that's developed because of this type of thing. The specific example of which, in this case, is the tobacco industry as the merchant of doubt. All right, thanks. Bye.